الله أكبر الله أكبر.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Brothers and sisters, as the month of Ramadan is quickly approaching, it is important for us to prepare for this blessed month. And we all have our shortcomings and our weaknesses which we need to focus on before the month of Ramadan. And from those shortcomings that some of us may have, and even if some of us don't have it, it's something we can always improve on, is our reflection, contemplation and recitation of the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Book of Allah, brothers and sisters, should be playing an integral role in our lives. This book is a book of guidance. Hudan lil-muttaqeen, a guidance to those who have taqwa. And because it's a means of guidance for the believer, it should be something that's close to one's heart. One should be referring back to the Qur'an because it's guiding you in this life and for a better life in the akhirah. And the Qur'an, brothers and sisters, has many virtues. And there are many benefits of reciting the Qur'an, contemplating the Qur'an. First and foremost is that when one recites the Qur'an, one needs to realize that what he is reciting is the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the speech of Allah. When you're reciting the Qur'an, you're uttering the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're reciting the Qur'an, the words of Allah. And no doubt, the Qur'an is Mubarak. It's blessed. Anyone who recites the Qur'an is going to have that blessing in his life. It's going to affect him in his deen and his dunya in a positive manner. The Qur'an, brothers and sisters, has its rewards. The Prophet ﷺ told us about the virtues and rewards of the one who recites the Qur'an. مَنْ قَرَأَ حَرْفًا مِنْ كِتَابِ اللَّهِ, the one who recites the book of Allah, the one who recites a letter from the book of Allah. فَلَهُ بِهِ حَسَنَةٌ, he will have a reward. وَالْحَسَنَةُ بِعَشْرِ أَمْثَالِهَا, and that reward is multiplied up to 10 times. You'll get 10 good deeds just for reciting one letter. The Prophet ﷺ said, لَا أَقُولُ أَلِفْ لَامْ مِيمْ حَرْفٌ, I don't mean that alif lam mim is a letter. وَلَكِنْ أَلِفٌ حَرْفٌ وَلَامٌ حَرْفٌ وَمِيمٌ حَرْفٌ. But alif is a letter, lam is a letter, mim is a letter. So can you imagine, brothers and sisters, reciting pages upon pages of the Qur'an and the reward a person will attain just from reciting the book of Allah Azza wa Jal. The Qur'an, brothers and sisters, is in the Arabic language, and not all of us are native Arabic speakers. And some of us, when we recite the Qur'an, we may struggle, we may stutter. In fact, even Arabs may stutter and struggle when reciting the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ spoke about this in a hadith. And he said, Al-Mahiru bil-Qur'an ma'a safarati al-kiram al-barara. The expert of the Qur'an, the one who recites the Qur'an proficiently, will be with the noble scribes, meaning his status will be that of the angels. And the one who struggles and stutters when reciting Qur'an, he has to repeat the word or repeat the ayah again and again. فَلَهُ أَجْران. This person, he will have 2 rewards. He will have double the reward. Why does he have double the reward, brothers and sisters? Because even though he's struggling, even though he's finding it hard, he doesn't think to himself, forget it, I'm not even going to bother reading Qur'an. He keeps on trying. He makes the effort. He's stuttering. He's struggling. He's tripping. But he continues to read because he wants to attain the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Qur'an, brothers and sisters, is a intercessor. It's an intercessor for the believer on the Day of Judgment. The Prophet ﷺ, he told us that the Qur'an will be an evidence for you or an evidence against you on the Day of Judgment. And it will be an evidence for the believer who recited the Qur'an as it was supposed to be recited. He would contemplate the Qur'an, he would act upon the Qur'an, he would reflect upon the Qur'an, he would recite it in the manner that it's supposed to be recited in. This individual on the Day of Judgment, the Qur'an will come and it will protect him by Allah's permission. And the Qur'an will say, oh Allah, he used to recite me when he was alive, defending you just because you spent time with the Qur'an when you were alive. And the Qur'an also, brothers and sisters, could be an evidence against you for the one who never recited as it was supposed to be recited, never acted upon the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He recited the verses and the ayat, but those ayat, when they were commanding him to do something, he never did them. When those ayat were prohibiting him from doing something, he would do them. He wasn't acting upon the Qur'an, and he wouldn't give the Qur'an its right. On the Day of Judgment, the Qur'an will be an evidence against this person and not an evidence for him. Brothers and sisters, contemplation of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something which is very important. Because we don't want to be reading the Qur'an without reflecting, without contemplating, without realizing that this book that we're reciting is unlike any other book. It should have an effect on the person's heart. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, he would say that some of the people, they say, we've read the whole Qur'an and we haven't missed a single letter. And he would say, by Allah, they've missed all of the Qur'an. They haven't recited anything. They think they've recited the whole Qur'an, they haven't recited not one letter. Because you don't see the effects of the Qur'an in their manners and their day-to-day actions. It's not reflective in their life. You don't see them enacting the Qur'an. Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, she would say about the Prophet ﷺ, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, that his manners was the Qur'an. He was a walking embodiment of the Qur'an. If you wanted to see somebody who was behaving in the manner in which the Qur'an dictates, it was the Prophet ﷺ. So the Qur'an, brothers and sisters, should have an effect on a person's life. How can a person increase his reflection and contemplation of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? From the ways a person can contemplate the Qur'an or increase his contemplation of the Qur'an is by beautifying his recitation. The sunnah of reading the Qur'an, brothers and sisters, is that the person recites the Qur'an in a melodious tune, in a melodious way, not as if he's reading just any other book. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, لَيْسَ مِنَّا مَنْ لَمْ يَتَغَنَّ بِالْقُرْآنِ. He isn't from amongst us the one who doesn't beautify his recitation of the Qur'an. It's meant to be beautified, because it is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most beautiful. And so when you recite the Qur'an, you recite in a beautiful manner. At times the Prophet ﷺ, he would recite the Qur'an and the people would hear, and he would beautify his recitation, and he was moving. Many examples we know from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, when he would recite Qur'an to non-Muslims, and they would hear the Qur'an and they would accept Islam. Just from the Prophet ﷺ reciting Qur'an. And this is due to the message of the Qur'an and the way the Prophet ﷺ would recite the Qur'an. The Prophet ﷺ, sometimes he would hear the Qur'an being recited from others. He once asked one of the companions to recite the Qur'an, and he wanted to hear. And the companion, he said, "O Messenger of Allah, you want me to recite to you the Qur'an, and the Qur'an was revealed to you?" And he said, "I love hearing the Qur'an." And he would recite the Qur'an for the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ would start to cry as a result of the beauty of the recitation of the Qur'an by the companions. So brothers and sisters, beautifying our voices for the Qur'an, for the recitation of the Qur'an, is something which we have been told to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا. Recite the Qur'an in a measured recitation, in a correct manner. And nowadays we have the habit, the bad habit, of rushing when we recite the Qur'an. And the scholars, they speak about the rights of the Book of Allah. From the rights, brothers and sisters, is that when a person recites the Qur'an, he recites by giving every single letter its right. And this is in fact from the rules of tajweed. They say tajweed itself refers to reciting the Qur'an and giving every single letter the right that it deserves. Whether it's prolonging the sound, whether it's pronouncing it in the correct manner, or even if it's a silent letter, not reciting that letter or pronouncing the sound of that letter. But the point is here, brothers and sisters, that when one recites the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he recites properly. He recites in a measured tone. He recites in a melodious tone. He's perfecting his recitation of the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When a person does this, he's increasing his tadabbur and contemplation of the Qur'an. When you recite the Qur'an in a measured tone, when you recite the Qur'an in a melodious tone, it requires more effort, requires more focus. You're focusing more on what you're reading. And a measured recitation leads to contemplation. When a person recites quickly, he doesn't know what he's reading. He's rushing. He just wants to get to the end of the page or the end of the surah. He's not really reflecting on what exactly he's reciting. Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, he said, al-Isra' fil qira'ah, hastening in recitation of the Qur'an, hastening in reciting the Qur'an, shows a lack of understanding of the meaning of the Qur'an. He's not really reflecting on the meaning. He's just rushing the recitation. Maybe he thinks he has to do a certain amount of pages. There needs to be a level of reflection. And the more one puts into the Qur'an, the more effort a person takes in reciting the Qur'an, the more he'll get out of the Qur'an. The less a person puts into the Qur'an, the less he'll get out of the Qur'an. From the ways, brothers and sisters, that we can have increased contemplation of the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is by a person reciting the Qur'an whenever he gets an opportunity, whether it's during the day or during the night. And whenever a person has time, he should take some time and recite the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are blessed to live in a time when we can have the Qur'an on our mobile phones. And a person could be anywhere, and he could have access to the Qur'an. He could be reciting the Qur'an wherever he may be. So when a person is in a situation where he's free, or he has some time, he should reflect and recite as much of the Qur'an as he's able to, or as much as he can. And from the times when a person's recitation is encouraged, is reciting at night, during the night. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, إِنَّ نَاشِئَةَ اللَّيْلِ هِيَ أَشَدُّ وَطْئًا وَأَقْوَى مُقِيلًا. That worship in the night is more impactful and suitable for recitation. A person makes more effort to reflect on what he's reciting during the night time. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, speaking about this ayah, he said, وَأَقْوَى مُقِيلًا, suitable for recitation. What does that mean? What is it referring to? He says a person is more likely to show understanding of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during the night time. Why? Because of the silence of the night. A person isn't preoccupied with his work or his family. He's not thinking about this or that or the other. There's complete silence. Everybody is sleeping. And as a result of the silence of the night, people aren't speaking, everyone's sleeping. There's this beautiful silence where a person can recite the Qur'an, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who hears all things, is listening, and you're reciting the book of Allah Azza wa Jal, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for your efforts. And as a result of that silence in the night, a lack of worry about work and about family, a person ends up reflecting more on the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He takes his time. He's taking time to ponder and reflect on the Qur'an. And of course we know that the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, he would recite the Qur'an during the night. And he would pray during the night. And in his salawat, he would recite for long periods of time. Free from any worldly occupation or jobs or worldly duties. He focuses on the Qur'an, and he focuses on reciting the Qur'an in his salah. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he also spoke about one night when he was sleeping, and the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam woke up and he was praying. And Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu prayed with the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam. And the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam recited the whole of Surah Baqarah and Surah al-Imran, and even more than this in one single rak'ah. One rak'ah, brothers and sisters. So this really shows us the sacrifices that the Prophet ﷺ would make in terms of his sleep in order to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the effects that that had on the life of the Prophet ﷺ. We sometimes think that sacrificing our sleep is going to be detrimental to our lives. It's going to affect our energy, and we're going to feel more tired. But the life of the Prophet ﷺ is a perfect example of how when one recites the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when one remembers Allah Azza wa Jal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts barakah and blessing in your life. So in fact, the more you remember Allah, the more you sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more Allah will place barakah and blessing in your life. Now this is no more evident than the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Look at what the Prophet ﷺ accomplished in such a short amount of time, 23 years. The Prophet ﷺ lived a total of 63 years of his life. 40 of those years was when he wasn't even a messenger. He wasn't even a prophet of Allah Azza wa Jal. Only 23 years of his life was he chosen to be a messenger of Allah. And look at the amount that the Prophet ﷺ accomplished. And no doubt, brothers and sisters, that this was due to his tawakkul and reliance upon Allah Azza wa Jal, and also on his ibadah and on his worship of Allah Azza wa Jal, and how he was constantly remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worshipping Allah Azza wa Jal during the day and during the night, and reciting the book of Allah. Many of the companions, they would narrate and they would say, when they would go in to meet the Prophet ﷺ, that they would see him and he would be in a state of salah. He would be praying, voluntary prayers. Many narrations. I went in and I saw the Prophet ﷺ and he was praying. He was performing the salah. And so this was the state that the Prophet ﷺ was in on a regular basis. And so we see, brothers and sisters, reciting the book of Allah Azza wa Jal during the night will bring about barakah and blessing in a person's life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Qur'an, يَتْلُونَ آيَاتِ اللَّيْلِ آنَاءَ اللَّيْلِ يَتْلُونَ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ آنَاءَ اللَّيْلِ, that the righteous believers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they recite the Qur'an for long periods of the night. Because this is when a person can increase his contemplation of the Qur'an. Finally, brothers and sisters, from the ways a person can contemplate the book of Allah Azza wa Jal is by understanding the meaning of the Qur'an, reflecting on the meaning of the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, it's so much easier for a person today to understand the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I don't think anyone has any excuse not to have learned the Arabic language. We are in an environment, in a circumstance where a person has access to Arabic language, to courses and lessons, whether they are in person or online. For a person to claim that he is completely ignorant, 100% ignorant of the Arabic language, is something in this day and age which would be unacceptable. A person has so much available to him, and no one is expecting a person to learn 100% of the Arabic language or to be an expert in the Arabic language. But for a person to just learn Quranic Arabic, for him to take a course and learn Quranic Arabic so he can get closer to the Book of Allah and gain a connection to Allah Azza wa Jal, brothers and sisters, we all know this is something which is definitely not an excuse for a person to have less contemplation and connection with Allah Azza wa Jal and with the Qur'an. It's possible for every single one of us to learn the basics so that one understands the Book of Allah Azza wa Jal to a certain degree. And no doubt, brothers and sisters, this will help a person have more contemplation of the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because many times we may read ayat, recite verses of the Qur'an in the Arabic language, but it takes a person to know the meaning for it to have a true effect. And of course it's possible that a person can recite the Qur'an or he can hear the Qur'an, and that Qur'an has an effect on the person, even though he doesn't understand the meaning. A person may be praying behind someone, or he may be hearing the Qur'an being recited on his devices. And even though he doesn't understand what's being recited, it can have a huge impact. Can you imagine, brothers and sisters, knowing the meaning of what's being recited? And how much of an impact that would have on his heart and on his connection with the Book of Allah Azza wa Jal. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Brothers and sisters, we were speaking about the importance of reciting and contemplating the Qur'an and the rewards associated with the person who recites the Qur'an, and how the Qur'an, when recited, he will be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with 10 good deeds for each letter he recites. And how the Qur'an, when it's recited by the one who struggles and stutters when he recites Qur'an, he will have double the reward because of his efforts. And how the Qur'an will be an evidence for the believer who recited the Qur'an on the Day of Judgment. Brothers and sisters, from the etiquettes of the Qur'an and from the importance and ways that a person can increase his contemplation of the Qur'an is al-insat, remaining silent when the Qur'an is being recited. Sometimes we have a habit of playing the Qur'an in the background. Sometimes the Qur'an becomes an alternative to music, for example. And a person likes to have it played in the background and he's preoccupied with other things, maybe with work, and he's talking to others, or he's busy with family, or he's in the car, and is not really paying attention to what's being recited. This is a lack of respect to the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If one wishes, he can play something else which is halal, which is in the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Book of Allah, brothers and sisters, is a message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to us. It's not meant to be something that's played in the background. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in fact, speaks about how a person should conduct himself when the Qur'an is being recited. وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنُ, when the Qur'an is being recited, فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ, then pay attention and listen to it. وَأَنصِتُوا, and remain silent. لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ, so that you may be shown mercy. This ayah, brothers and sisters, it shows us the importance of contemplating and reflecting upon the Qur'an when it's being recited and not talking. And in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us the virtues and the benefits of one who does this. When a person doesn't talk when the Qur'an is being recited, and he listens to the Qur'an when it is being recited, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will show mercy, and mercy will descend upon that individual, so that you may be shown mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will show you mercy when you're remaining silent and you're listening to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Brothers and sisters, everything we've just mentioned today is a reminder so that we can prepare for the month of Ramadan, so that we can gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the blessed month of Ramadan. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us life so that we're able to witness another Ramadan, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses our Ramadan this year, and that Allah Azza wa Jal eases the suffering of those who are in Palestine and those all over the world, and that they're able to make the most of their Ramadan, and that Allah Azza wa Jal eases their difficulties. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma ighfir lil muslimina wal muslimat wal mu'minina wal mu'minat al ahya'i minhum wal amwat. Inna Allah ya'murukum bil 'adli wal ihsan wa ita'i dhil qurba وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون فاذكروا الله العظيم الجليل يذكركم واشكروه على نعمه يزدكم ولذكر الله أعلى وأولى وأكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون.